For more than 3 centuries, the Romanov family ruled as the heart of the Russian Empire. They lived in glittering palaces, hosted grand ceremonies, and carried a sense of divine right over millions of people. Yet, by the early 1900s, cracks in this royal image began to show. Russia faced huge problems: wars, poverty, and political unrest. Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor, was not prepared to handle the storm. He was a man born into privilege, but unequipped for the age of revolutions. The First World War made everything worse. Russian soldiers died in vast numbers, food shortages spread across the land, and angry crowds filled the streets. In March 1917, under intense pressure from his government and even his own army, Nicholas was forced to give up the throne. His abdication ended more than 300 years of Romanov rule. The once powerful royal family was reduced to prisoners of the state. Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the young heir Alexio, were placed under guard. Along with them were a few loyal attendants who chose to remain with the family. Their new life was a sharp contrast to their past. Instead of ballrooms and royal banquets, they faced daily restrictions, isolation, and constant uncertainty. At first, they lived under house arrest in relative comfort, but as the revolution grew harsher, their conditions worsened. By 1918, they were moved to a house in the industrial city of Yekaterinburg, surrounded by Bolshevik guards. Windows were painted over, movements were limited, and hope for rescue began to fade. The family could sense danger, but they did not know that history was about to take its darkest turn. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, the Romanovs faced their tragic end. With the Russian Civil War raging, anti-Bolshevik forces, known as the White Army, were advancing toward Yekaterinburg. Fearing that the Romanovs might be rescued and restored to power, local Soviet leaders received secret orders from Moscow. The family must not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. That night, Nicholas, Alexandra, their children, and the 4 attendants were woken and told they would be moved for their own safety. They were led to the basement of the house. The room was small, crowded, and brightly lit by a harsh lamp. Guards entered, armed with guns and bayonets. The prisoners were confused, perhaps hoping for relocation. Instead, they were read a brief statement and immediately shot. Bullets flew wildly in the cramped space, ricocheting off walls. Some family members survived the first volley, forcing the guards to finish the job with bayonets and rifle butts. The scene was chaotic, bloody, and horrifying. Within minutes, 11 people lay dead on the floor, 7 members of the royal family, and 4 loyal servants. Yet for the Bolsheviks, killing the Romanovs was not enough. They wanted to erase the dynasty completely. Their bodies had to be hidden so that no one could create a martyr out of the Romanovs. What followed was just as brutal as the executions. The killers loaded the bodies onto a truck and attempted to dump them into a nearby mine shaft. They stripped jewelry, poured acid, and even set some remains on fire. But the shaft was too shallow, and the bodies remained visible. Fearing discovery, the executioners dragged the remains out again. In their panic, they mutilated some of the corpses, smashing bones and burning what they could. Eventually, they dug 2 makeshift graves in the forest, one for most of the family and attendants, and another for Alexei and one of his sisters. The Romanovs had been erased from life and hidden from memory. At least, that was the plan after the murders. The Soviet government refused to admit what had happened. For years, there were no official reports, no marked graves, and no public trials. The Romanovs simply disappeared from history books. Yet whispers spread quickly. Across Russia and beyond, people speculated about the family's fate. Were they truly all dead? Or had one or more children survived the massacre? These questions fueled endless rumors. In Europe, newspapers published unconfirmed sightings of Romanov heirs. Letters and telegrams claimed knowledge of secret escapes. Monarchists clung to hope that the children had been spirited away and might one day return to restore the throne. The most famous of all these stories centered on Anastasia, the youngest daughter. In 1920, a woman named Anna Anderson appeared in Berlin, claiming to be the lost princess. Her tale was captivating. She said she had survived the execution and escaped Russia with the help of sympathizers. Her physical resemblance, scars, and refusal to abandon her claim convinced some people. Court battles lasted for decades as Anderson fought to prove her identity. Books and films turned her story into legend. She became a symbol of hope, a surviving Romanov who might have outlived the horrors of that night. But doubts persisted. Many relatives and experts rejected her story, while others desperately wanted to believe. Through Anna Anderson and others like her, the myth of Romanov's survival lived on. For much of the 20th century, the lack of physical evidence allowed these legends to thrive. The truth was hidden underground. Waiting for discovery, the real breakthrough began quietly in the 1970s when a Russian geologist, Alexander Avdonin, discovered a grave near Ufa. Inside were 9 skeletons, buried in secrecy. Fearing the Soviet regime, he kept the discovery hidden for years. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 did the world learn of the mass grave. The remains were exhumed and analyzed. Forensic experts confirmed that they belonged to Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, and several attendants. But the discovery came with a mystery. 2 bodies were missing. Alexei, the young heir, and one of his sisters, either Maria or Anastasia, were not in the grave. Their absence reopened the door to decades of speculation. Could the children have escaped, after all? Or were they buried somewhere else, still hidden by time and secrecy? For many, the missing bodies seemed like proof that the survival stories might be true. Governments, historians, and families debated the evidence. Films and books continued to portray Anastasia as a lost princess, keeping hope alive. But science was advancing quickly. DNA analysis, which had become increasingly powerful in the late 20th century, promised to provide answers that rumor and myth could not. The Romanov mystery was moving from whispered tales into the bright light of forensic science. By the 1990s, DNA testing had become a revolutionary tool in both criminal cases and historical investigations. Scientists began extracting DNA from the Romanov bones found in the mass grave. They used 2 main techniques: nuclear DNA testing, which analyzes repeating patterns in genetic code, and mitochondrial DNA testing, which traces the maternal line. To confirm identities, they needed living relatives of the Romanovs for comparison. That's where Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, came in. He was a close relative through the maternal side, related to Serena Alexandra. When Prince Philip agreed to provide a blood sample, it allowed scientists to compare his DNA with the remains. The results were clear. Alexandra and her daughters were confirmed beyond doubt. For Nicholas II, the testing was slightly more complicated because of a rare condition in his DNA called heteroplasmy, meaning he had more than one type of mitochondrial DNA. Still, the overall genetic evidence matched. By the mid-1990s, science had solved part of the mystery. The Romanovs in the grave were indeed who they appeared to be, but the 2 missing children remained unaccounted for. Their absence continued to fuel conspiracy theories and keep the myths alive. For almost 2 more decades, the Romanov case remained open in the public's imagination. It would take another discovery to close it forever. In 2007, nearly 90 years after the murders, another discovery was made near the first burial site. A group of amateur archaeologists searching the forest uncovered bone fragments, pieces of skull, and teeth. The remains were small and partially burned, showing signs of attempts to destroy them. Scientists carefully studied the bones and concluded they belonged to a boy aged 12 to 15 and a girl aged 15 to 19. The ages matched Alexei and one of his sisters. But suspicion remained after decades of myths. Could these really be the missing? Once again, DNA testing provided the answers. Samples were compared with both the first set of remains and with living Romanov relatives, including descendants connected to Nicholas's brother. The results were undeniable. Mitochondrial DNA confirmed the girl was a daughter of Alexandra. Y chromosome testing confirmed the boy was Nicholas's son. Together, the evidence proved that the fragments belonged to Alexei and one of his sisters, likely Maria. At last, the final pieces of the puzzle were found. All 7 Romanov children, along with their parents and attendants, had been accounted for. The scientific verdict left no room for doubt. The results were heartbreaking. For decades, the legend of Romanov's survival had provided hope to people across the world. The story of Anastasia in particular inspired films, books, and fairy tales, turning tragedy into a symbol of endurance. Many clung to the possibility that one child had slipped through the chaos of revolution. But the DNA evidence destroyed these dreams. The truth was brutal. No one survived. On that night in 1918, the Romanovs were all killed, their bodies hidden in shallow graves. The tales of escape, imposters, and lost heirs were proven false. Anna Anderson was not Anastasia, and no Romanov child lived in secret exile. What the world had hoped was a story of survival was in fact a story of total annihilation. The romantic myths collapsed under the weight of cold science. History's most famous royal mystery had been solved, and the ending was darker than anyone had imagined. Although the truth was grim, the Romanov case became an important milestone in forensic science. It showed how DNA could answer questions that had lingered for nearly a century. Techniques used in the Romanov investigation, such as mitochondrial DNA sequencing and Y chromosome testing, are now standard in solving modern crimes, identifying disaster victims, and verifying historical remains. In this sense, the tragedy of the Romanovs advanced science that continues to serve justice today. But closure did not bring comfort. The truth erased the hopeful legends and replaced them with a harsh reality. An entire dynasty was wiped out in one night. And the world's longing for a miracle was only a dream. The Romanov mystery was solved, but it left behind sorrow instead of relief. Their story remains one of the most haunting in history, a royal family destroyed by revolution, erased by secrecy, and rediscovered only through the language of DNA. The fate of the Romanovs was never just a Russian story, it became a global obsession. From Europe to America, newspapers followed every rumor with eager headlines. Monarchists in exile clung to the idea that one of the Romanov children might have escaped, seeing survival as a beacon of hope against communist rule. In Hollywood, the legend of Anastasia inspired movies and stage plays, often portraying her as a lost princess trying to rediscover her identity. This fascination was not simply about history, it was about longing. The world wanted a fairy tale ending, a sign that innocence had survived the brutality of revolution. During the Cold War, the Romanov mystery also played a role in propaganda. In the West, tales of survival highlighted the cruelty of the Bolsheviks and the tragedy of Russia's lost monarchy. In the Soviet Union, however, the subject was taboo. For decades, the state avoided open discussion of the Romanov murders, fearing that acknowledgement would tarnish the image of the revolution. When the graves were finally uncovered, and DNA results confirmed the truth, it forced a confrontation, not just with history, but also with decades of myth. People realized that for nearly a century, stories of hope had been woven from little more than rumor and imagination. Yet even after the scientific confirmation, fascination with the Romanovs did not end. If anything, it grew stronger. Museums, books, documentaries, and films continue to explore their lives and deaths. The image of a royal family destroyed by violence, yet remembered through legend, keeps capturing hearts around the world. The Romanovs are gone, but their mystery reshaped how history is remembered and retold. What makes the Romanov story so haunting is not only the brutality of their deaths, but also what it reveals about human nature and history. The rise and fall of the dynasty shows how fragile power can be. A family once seen as divinely chosen rulers ended in a basement with no ceremony, erased by those who had once called them leaders. For the world, this tragedy is a warning about unchecked authority, political violence, and the way revolutions consume